Good morning. It is 9:11 a.m. on Sunday, June 17th, 2018. I'm Christiana Ellis and I just got up. This is 5 more minutes. It's Sunday, which means it's time to continue my rewatch of the anime The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya. Today we are talking about Season 1, Episode 5 in the broadcast order, which is entitled The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya Part 3. So once again, if you've been watching along, you know that we're doing the broadcast order. If you have just jumped in with this episode, that's the episode we're talking about today. So, this episode finally establishes more or less like here's the whole situation. In a lot of ways, we've been hinting at things, and even still, a lot of things are unexplained. But the primary setup of the story is finally established here. Obviously, this episode features the proper introduction of Itsuki Koizumi, who obviously we saw in the first episode, the Adventures of Mikuru Asahina episode, where they're making the movie. We see him there, obviously. And in last week's episode, The Boredom of Haruhi Suzumiya, he was already a part of the SOS Brigade while they're playing baseball. But now we flash back in time to continue the cliffhanger that we had previously left off and also introduce him and set up a few other things. But the cliffhanger, right? So when we watched the Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya Part 2, we finished that episode with Yuki Nagato telling Kyon, inviting him over to her suspiciously empty apartment and telling him essentially that she is not a normal human because she's actually an alien, and that Haruhi is also not normal. And so in this episode, we begin with her elaborating on that point, basically implying first that there is some sort of a weird astral being called the data thought entity, I think is the, I'm suddenly, it's, something to that effect, right? I'm looking, just try to repeat it properly. And just none of my notes are just laying it all out. But the point is, some sort of weird alien astral creature that's difficult to comprehend. And what she explains is that it has no ability to communicate in language, but because humans can only communicate in language, it created her kind of like a robot to be an interface between the thought entity and humans. And the purpose of her mission is to investigate a data explosion that occurred on Earth 3 years ago. And what we learn is that it monitors the amount of data and it calls it environmental data in the universe. And in monitoring all of that, it says 3 years ago, an enormous explosion of new data was created. And at the center of it, Haruhi Suzumiya. And that it essentially believes that she is responsible in some way to do, for this huge data explosion, that there's something very unusual about it, and that she appears to be able to manipulate the environmental data or reality to her benefit just at will, but without realizing that she's doing it. And in some ways, that explanation, finally jives with some of the stuff that we've seen, some of the things that were hinted at last time. This idea that, when Kyon was talking in the baseball game about this idea that, like, no matter how unlikely it is, somehow Haruhi might just make them win the tournament. And so that's what he's talking about, right? It also talks a little bit about Yuki as this strange alien robot, and her ability to do things like the baseball bat homing mode, for example. The references also to, just what Haruhi is and how she might react to things. But so obviously Yuki is using very big words and explaining a lot of crazy information really fast, and so Kyon is struggling a little bit to say, like, this is kind of out there. Um, you're an alien robot or something, and somehow this girl Haruhi is able to bend reality to her will somehow. What's going on there? That's pretty crazy. And who can blame Kyon at that point, right? I mean, he has not seen anything at that point to justify such an extreme, explanation for things. Like, he's seen some weird stuff. Haruhi is clearly an unusual individual, so is Yuki. But I think it's reasonable for him to not believe Yuki at this point, because frankly, she has not really demonstrated anything other than maybe she's weird and just told him this story, right? But I'm going to pair that with a couple of other things that happen in this episode, and that's what starts bringing Kyon around to this idea, right? So, after meeting with her, drinking tea, and hearing this strange explanation, Kyon goes home, sleeps it off, goes to school the next day, and in the club room afterwards, first of all, Mikuru has returned to school. We may recall that she had been absent the previous day, specifically, presumably, because she was so embarrassed after the initial bunny girl incident. The bunny girl incident and the computer club incident, I believe, were I think it was the computer club incident that was specifically what had occurred in this example. Or was it? Now I can't even remember which one it was. It could have easily been both, right? So the point is, though, that she's back. And once again, she, there in the club room, says a few unusual things like, that are just a little bit weird. Like, why did you come back exactly? Well, it's unclear. She's being a little bit weird about it. And then we also have... Yeah, I always rewatch these episodes right before I talk about them, or at least the night before, and then I have a little wiki summary that I sometimes watch, but sometimes it's not as clear on the moment to moment stuff. It just talks in generalities. But so in any event, we meet now the mysterious transfer student that Haruhi had hoped would happen. She had previously talked about the idea that there's a certain period in a year that would be an unusual time to transfer into a new school. Therefore, anyone who transfers to a school during that unusual time must be a mysterious transfer student of the type that she had hoped to attract. And we meet this mysterious transfer student who she abducts more like she did with Mikuru. But he is amiable about it and follows along. And so shows up, and sure enough, it's Itsuki Koizumi, who Kyon doesn't know in any way at this point, but we recognize as like, oh, yeah, he's the last main member of the SOS Brigade that we hadn't been introduced to properly yet. But he comes in, is basically saying, okay, so you want me to be part of this club? What is it? And this is where Haruhi explains the whole purpose of the SOS Brigade, and we could have guessed, around the edges of it, but more or less it is to find aliens, espers, and time travelers and hang out with them. And that lines up with some of the things where she says that she wants those things to exist just because they're more interesting. The world is cooler if those things exist. And so this idea that the club's activities are basically going to just be about looking for evidence of strange activities and just investigating them just because it's fun. And just like, sure, okay. And really, the only problem with that is, what's the likelihood that you'll actually find any? But we are already starting to gather that it's going to be a little bit more complicated than that because what's going on here exactly? So for one, we already have one girl who has identified herself to Kyon as an alien. So they go and they're spending their day off school wandering around a train station to look for stuff, and they keep splitting into teams to go and look. And we have Kyon showing up, and he's going along with it, but complaining all the way, which is an ongoing theme with his character. But so at first he's paired with Mikuru, and we see something that obviously continues to develop, which is that Haruhi seems irritated to have Kyon get paired with Mikuru at this point. It's not super subtle that she seems like she wants to have gotten paired with Kyon, but the random nature of her own method doesn't work that way. And so, it doesn't work out. It keeps assigning her elsewise. And it's interesting just to think a little bit about the idea of on what level do her powers work, on how many of them, if she wanted to have been paired with Kyon, could she have made that happen? It seems like it's a little random thing. So if it didn't work out that way, what does it mean? Maybe nothing. Maybe it's just a way of trying to set up and establish a couple of things. First of all, allowing Kyon to be away from Haruhi for a moment and paired with Mikuru and Yuki individually so we can have those scenes, and to establish that Haruhi seems a little bit jealous about that. Maybe. Anyway, we have also, as Kyon arrives, the first incidence of him actually being early, but just because everyone else was more early, he gets yelled at for being late. That's another running gag throughout the series. But in any event, he first gets paired with Mikuru, and she's saying some weird stuff too, and he's walking with her, and this is where she reveals to him her story. And like Yuki's, it would be pretty hard to believe, except it also seems like a pretty significant coincidence that Mikuru, in ways that seem unrelated to Yuki's story, says that she's a time traveler from the future that is here specifically because there was an enormous time quake 3 years ago with Haruhi Suzumiya at the center, and that she is here to watch and investigate and figure out what's going on. So that's a remarkably similar story to Yuki's, except for being a time traveler instead of, an alien. And in a lot of ways, we could imagine that Mikuru is perhaps more trustworthy in this storytelling than Yuki, in the sense that we could imagine Yuki just being a really weird girl who reads a lot of science fiction. I mean, that's actually what Kyon suspects at first, right? That he, something in his gut tells him there's more to it, but it's easy enough to write it off that way. But for Mikuru and Yuki to each independently tell him similar stories that focus around an event that centered on Haruhi Suzumiya 3 years ago, when she is obsessed with, Haruhi is obsessed with aliens and time travelers, and now there's an alien and a time traveler. They're both here to investigate something that happened to her 3 years ago. The only, there's a explanation that, for example, Yuki and Mikuru are teaming up to play a trick on Kyon, right? That could be a possible explanation. And in our real world, that might have been more likely. But it starts to become a little weirder because we think, what do we know of Mikuru? Does she seem like the kind of person to come up with a really bizarre story like that, to play a prank on someone, and to execute it so effectively? She doesn't seem like that kind of person. So she would have to be capable of behavior fairly different than what we have seen from her so far for her to be participating in that kind of a prank. Because we've seen, although Kyon hasn't yet, we've seen her acting ability, right? Um, she seems very sincere in telling him this story, and of course, we're watching it knowing already that more or less that this seems to be true. But when we put ourselves in Kyon's perspective, we can imagine, okay, Yuki's story was very strange, but there's maybe more likely explanations for what's going on. It's easy to kind of try to dismiss that way, even if something in his gut's telling me it's not it might be true. But with Mukuru telling a similar story and not seeming like the kind of person to play a prank, that starts to feel even stranger. So when we when the SOS brigade reconvenes, we have the team meeting for lunch, and neither team found anything. But what's I think a little bit interesting is that first of all, we know that although Kyon found a time traveler, they weren't really actually looking for any other phenomena. They were just wandering around exactly like Haruhi accuses them, right? You were really looking, you weren't just wandering around, right? And they say, what Kyon says is like, well, you didn't find anything either, did you? And she didn't, but she's irritated by that explanation. And this, is a running theme, and we'll revisit that in a moment. But it's the afternoon session of searching. Once again, they do the random draw with the sticks, and once again, Haruhi gets paired with Itsuki, and this time Mikuru, leaving Kyon paired with Yuki. And Yuki, he takes her to the library, and she is fascinated by it, and Kyon actually falls asleep. And then when he is, receives the call to tell him to report back, there's a whole extended sequence where like he actually has to help Yuki sign up for a library card so that she can take the book she was reading with her, which is kind of fun and worth kind of commenting on, just if only briefly, not just because it's amusing in this episode, but because without spoiling too much, it becomes more significant later. This little thing that he did for her, helping her get a library card. But in any event, he indicates to her, Mikuru just told me this, and it makes me kind of reevaluate what you told me, and that maybe you're not crazy after all. And then, in any event, the team reconvenes, and once again, we know Kyon and Yuki didn't go looking for strange phenomena. He took her to the library and fell asleep. And she seems to intuit that they weren't really looking. Even though, again, from Kyon's perspective, he's now found an alien and a time traveler. But he's not telling her that, and we know that he wasn't really looking. She seems to intuit that without actually accusing him of lying. But, once again, he's like, well, you didn't find anything either. And he actually tries to be a little bit reasonable about it. It's like, well, if they were that secret, like, they wouldn't be this easy to find in one day, right? And she doesn't seem entirely satisfied with that explanation. And so I think it's just interesting to observe and think about whatever the nature of her powers, and even if she's unaware of them, we know that she's right in her accusation. Like, now, whether it's fair for her to demand that people cater to her desire to look for a strange phenomenon, she intuits that he's not being entirely straightforward and honest with her about it, and she's angry as a result. And so she storms off, suggesting we'll have to review your behavior on Monday, which is, it's like, it's a little pushy, right? And I think that at this point, I think one of the things that happens while watching the episodes in this season in this order is that we see Haruhi's development on a more linear arc, even though it's non chronological. Because what becomes clear over the course of the series is that there is more to her other than her just being this strange, powered individual who doesn't know it, is that she is a more complex character as well, and that becomes revealed. The nuances of her behavior are uncovered in in a way in this order, I think, better than this straightforward way. Excuse me. And then in the event, so if we think about what do we know of Haruhi at this point in the series with this order, we've been told, by a couple of different people. And in fact, let's just go ahead and deal with Itsuki's explanation too. Is that going back to the club room on Monday, he basically discusses with Koizumi. So you probably have something to tell me too? Sure enough, he does. And Haruhi didn't show up that day. She's annoyed, irritated last we saw her. And so Koizumi explains to Kion, he's an Esper. So, got alien, time traveler, Esper. It's the three categories of beings that Haruhi has said that she was interested in talking to. And Koizumi actually points out how interesting it is that while these things do exist, Haruhi, in looking for them, has subconsciously surrounded herself with them and doesn't realize it. And so his explanation from his organization is that as far as they can tell, this universe might actually only be 3 years old. Because Haruhi, with the power to create and destroy reality, seems to have wished for something so hard 3 years ago that she rewrote the world, and the world that exists now is only 3 years old, and that she could do it again at any time if she was ever dissatisfied with the world. And so now we can understand a bit better that Koizumi's default behavior in the SOS Brigade is whatever you want, Miss Suzumiya. And to Kion's great irritation, because, for example, in the whole maid uniform incident, we have, Kion frustrated. It's like, because he enters the room to see, Mikuru half undressed with Haruhi basically, like, struggling with her, and just says, "Don't mind me, go right ahead." So now we have three slightly different explanations for what is Haruhi. Is she just a being who is able to, there are three sort of perspectives on the same general sort of truth that all overlap. And once again, it seems like Kion is in the position of having to say, something's sure weird here. He has not at this point seen really proof of anything. But it seems very unusual that these three people, including the transfer student who just transferred to the school, are all in on the same prank with him. Haruhi certainly doesn't seem in on it. Although we could imagine her being, like, she doesn't seem interested in that. Like, the idea of playing a prank on Kion doesn't seem like, why would she? It doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that she is interested in doing. She is specifically said she is only interested in aliens, time travelers, espers, and doesn't care about normal humans, right? But so, at this point, he has been told by three different people similar stories. So that's kind of a weird thing to think about for him to process, and yet he still kind of keeps finding himself going to this club room. And, we, in this episode, also, drive forward some of the additional running gags of Haruhi forcing Mikuru to wear strange costumes in the club room, the running gag of her Kyon keeps walking into the club room when Mikuru is half naked, and we see that develop as that he at least at a certain point starts assuming that he should knock first. But we also see the whole element of him wanting to protect Mikuru, but he also thinks it's super sexy, and he's kind of a teenage hornball about it. Um, so that kind of develops. But now, at the conclusion of this episode, we have assembled the full SOS Brigade. We've now gotten the explanation, at least from each of their perspectives. Yuki's an alien. Mikuru's there as a time traveler who can't tell Kyon anything about the future because it's classified information. Koizumi is apparently an Esper who has powers in certain circumstances that I can't show you right now, but I will show you soon, I promise. And all of them are circled around Haruhi Suzumiya, who apparently is some sort of maybe non-capital G god, maybe capital G god, as if Koizumi's organization is to believed. If she is literally the creator of this universe, who can manipulate reality at her will, but it's a little bit erratic because she doesn't know she's doing it. And that's interesting. But one of the key aspects of the whole situation is not only doesn't she know, but you can't tell her. At least that's the approach everyone's been taking. And the idea is it's dangerous and unpredictable enough when she doesn't know. What if she knew she had this power? What would she do then? And the idea of that is so dangerous that everyone has defaulted to watch and observe. But we also do get Yuki mentioning there are other aspects of the thought entity that favor more aggressive interactions. Koizumi also says that there are members of the organization that think that maybe something more proactive should be done. And so now we understand a little bit better, first of all, Yuki's weird data manipulation in the baseball game, that, she seems to actually be an alien. So Kyon does at some point come to assume that that's true and sees evidence of her abilities. And we get referred to this idea that it is all about Haruhi's emotional state. And if that she is ever sufficiently unhappy or frustrated with the world, she might literally destroy it and create a new one in its place. So now the primary scenario of the series has been established, and we'll see where it goes from here. So we're going to get a whole run of not filler episodes, but side stories, in the non-chronological sense. So the next week, we're not going to be watching part 4. Instead, we're going to be jumping to the episode entitled Remote Island Syndrome Part 1. And that will be the next episode that we will watch. So now that we've had all the main characters introduced, let's send them on vacation. All right, so that does it for today. I will talk to you all tomorrow for 5 more minutes.